All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Developing and Adopting Economically Effective Pesticide Mitigation Strategies, Critical to the Survival of Agriculture and Endangered Species. I'm Chris Boomsma, CEO here at the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, or CAST. It's my privilege to briefly introduce to you today this webinar, which is number 4 in a larger series on FIFRA and ESA. So with that, I'm going to get started and make a few comments about CAST prior to handing it over to our moderator and presenters. So very briefly about CAST. It is a 501c3 membership-supported nonprofit organization formed in 1972 as a result of a 1970 National Academy of Sciences report. We are nonpartisan, apolitical, unbiased, and science-based, and proudly so. We are a membership-based organization, as said before. That membership is composed of both individuals and organization-level membership, scientific societies, universities, nonprofits, libraries, companies, and others. And in 2022 celebrated our 50th anniversary. On your screen now, you can see both our mission and our vision. And our mission is to convene and coordinate networks of experts to assemble, interpret, and communicate unbiased science-based information to policymakers, the media, the private sector, and the public. How do we accomplish it? Well, frankly, through the help of many generous volunteers. And I want to take time right now to acknowledge them. You can see the representation now, but I want to acknowledge each of them for their support of the organization, the great work they do. Our volunteers bring their subject matter expertise, their science, and their time to our organization to produce what you see, for example, today. Now with that, I'd like to bring on Tony Bird from Syngenta, who's going to serve as today's moderator. Tony, welcome back. And when you're ready, sir, take it away. And we look forward to today's webinar. Thanks a lot, Tony.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the introduction. So as Chris mentioned, this is the 4th webinar in our series of 6 webinars that we will have over the following weeks. And as you can see, the title, this one is focused on mitigations. Just a quick, shout out to the other chairs of this paper, Bernalyn McGahey and Stanley Culpepper. As we started this process, we tried to think of, some of the current things associated with ESA, of how we could basically it started as one paper, turned into a series of 6 papers, as we quickly realized. So if you were around for the first webinar, which was more of a historical perspective, the second one got into the legal background, the third covered more of the risk assessment process, and this one obviously will deal with mitigations. So first of all, just to remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and you can populate questions as the presenters are going on, so that way we have questions as the presentation is finished. And also that, just a note, the slides will be available afterwards, probably on the website. So if anyone was interested in that, you can check those as well too. So without further ado, I will first introduce our authors for today's paper and our speakers. So Dr. Leah Doozy is an ag economist and principal consultant at Compliance Services International and provides administrative and technical support to the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force, FESTIF. She completed her BA in economics from the University of South, her MS in agricultural economics from Purdue University, and a PhD in agricultural economics from Auburn University. Prior to joining CSI in 2017, Leah spent 15 years with USDA NRCS in St. Paul, Minnesota, and USDA ARS in Auburn, Alabama. Her primary work focuses on offering mitigation strategies and technical support for pesticides with the goal of regulatory predictability and environmental stewardship. Building from her background in production agriculture, working lands conservation and economics, Leah communicates regulatory policy and decisions to diverse audiences, including pesticide registrants, ag commodity groups, state regulators, non-ag users of pesticides, and a variety of other stakeholders. Our other presenter will be Dr. Taylor Randall Singleton, an assistant professor and the Extension Sustainability Specialist at the University of Georgia. She completed her BS in agriculture from Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College and her MS and PhD in weed science from the University of Georgia. Taylor began her professional career at University of Georgia in July, where her research and extension outreach will include sustainable cropping systems and agronomic and specialty crops with an emphasis in pesticide and stewardship. So at this point, I will turn it over to Leah.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Tony. And thank you, Chris, earlier. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk about this topic. It was really enjoyable to work with Taylor as we worked through this topic in this paper. So I'm going to give a little bit of a recent in parentheses history lesson on the mitigation measures. I know that in some of the prior presentations, you got a little bit of background about why we're talking about this topic, but I think it is important to talk about it from the standpoint of mitigation measures. So we do know that label mitigation measures are not necessarily new. There have been mitigation measures on labels prior to 2022, January of 2022, which is where I'm sort of starting our recent history. Those may have been county restrictions, buffers around water, soil type limitations where there's different rates for different soil types, tillage limitations, infield buffers like we see on the dicamba label, swath distance setbacks, and obviously bulletins live too. So there have always been these mitigation measures. They haven't necessarily been called mitigation measures. We've kind of talked about them in different ways, and our conversations around those restrictions and label use instructions have been different. And so the conversation really started to change, I think, in January of 2022. And so now we're looking at a different conversation related to mitigation measures and how we talk about them and what they're defined as and showing up as in some of our conversations. So now we're looking at the mitigation, the labels as they existed prior to 2022, but then we're also talking about interim ecological mitigations or IEMs. We've had conversations around like pick list, the mitigation menu of measures, and then also some consistent statements like the statement on BLT that we may start seeing across labels. And so really it's this change in conversation and the words we're using that we really have to understand as it relates to mitigation measures. Next slide, please, Chris. So in January of 22, we saw the draft Enlist 1 Duo decision come out, and it was broken up by hydrologic groups. So you had the hydrologic soil groups A and B, you had a hydrologic soil group C and D. There was this introduction of credits, and then there was this short list of mitigation measures that a grower would have the option to choose from. So that was really, at least at this point, the first introduction. There had been some discussions on pick lists coming from the National Marines Fisheries Service prior to 22, but really this is the first time we'd seen this in this context. And so we started having this conversation about what do these mitigation measures mean, what do these credits mean, and how is this going to apply to the grower? And then in April of 22, we saw the work plan come out from EPA, and then the subsequent November work plan, or the update to that work plan, where we saw a lot more information about this new terminology, interim ecological mitigations or IEMs. And so this is just an example from there. And so this is the surface water runoff. And this was the proposal in here is that the runoff mitigation would be, a grower would have to choose one of the following mitigation measures. And then there was a list. And then this was based off of different criteria. So not related to the soil groups, but related to the pesticide KOCs. And so we saw a little bit of a shift coming out of the ESA work plan. And then we saw this similar sort of mitigation menu come out in some of the proposed interim decisions that were released in November. So we saw this a little bit of a shift in sort of our language, how we're thinking about mitigation measures that kind of are leading our discussion to where we are today. Next slide, please. So I told you it was very short recent history. So that brings us to today. And by today, I just mean where we're sitting at right now as it relates to the most recent document that we've seen. I'm not talking about the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project because it didn't have the same mitigation measures in there as it does in the draft herbicide strategy. So the draft herbicide strategy was released in July of 2023. And this was to reduce exposure of federally listed endangered and threatened species and the designated critical habitat specific to conventional agricultural herbicides. And so that really is where the conversation is in this paper and in this presentation, is related to conventional agricultural herbicides. Also part of that that came out, but it was also with the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project, was this draft technical support that kind of goes in depth into the practices and some of the literature that's supporting those practices. So this is just the example from the draft herbicide strategy. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. This is not new, but I do think it's important to talk about how they're broken up, because it really, it's really about how we talk about the mitigation measures. So they're broken up by field characteristics, which I like to say are things you cannot change. So these are things that are specific to a field, both slope, soil type, where it's located. So those are things that can't be changed. And then you've got your application parameters. So how much of the product you're applying or how you're applying it. And then really where we get into the mitigation measures that you'll hear people call conservation practices or best management practices. And that's where you really get into those in-field management mitigation measures, things that growers are doing to manage their crops and manage their land. So some of these are management practices like tillage, and other ones like the adjacent to the field practices are where you have to see a change in your landscape. So if you add riparian areas, or like with the other mitigation measures, you add a water retention system as part of your irrigation system or your tile drainage. And so these are other mitigation measures that aren't captured above. And so they all have different point values, and those point values would then be combined together to meet the requirements of the draft herbicide strategy. Next slide, please. Given all of that, given we know the point system, the mitigation measures, which a lot of people see as conservation practices, some of them growers are already doing. So it is critical to understand, and this is kind of what we'll talk about for the remainder of the presentation, is how pesticide use and mitigation measures and ESA-listed species interact with each other. And I think there's a lot of I'm going to focus on this the most, because I think there's a lot of questions around how do those three things work together? Because in a lot of cases, we've looked at them very separately up to this point. The current extent and practicality of including best management practices or mitigation measures, conservation practices, whatever you want to call them, already used into these discussions. So how do we do that, and are we doing it enough? The role of existing and externally funded conservation programs. There are the potential for exemptions as part of the draft herbicide strategy of if you're participating in some sort of program, or you have a conservation plan. All of those discussions I know are ongoing and developing, but what is the role of those programs? And then the importance of being able to measure your outcome. Is it enough to understand the interaction to have these mitigation measures that we're looking at as part of this draft strategy or part of the work plan update, but really understanding the importance of knowing the outcomes, like what are the results of putting these mitigation measures in place? Next slide, please. So that intersection, pesticides use, mitigation measures, and ESA listed species, we're really, what we're talking about is that middle section where they all overlap. So pesticide stewardship, when I'm using the word stewardship here, it probably means a little bit different than maybe for some of the registrant community, but I'm thinking about it in this way of looking at the entire process of looking at pesticide use. So whether that's research, both at the private sector, the state level through university research, or through federal research with, say, ARS. Then you've got your education. So the pesticide safety education program. You've also got other education that goes on through extension. You have recommendations that are coming from a variety of audiences, whether that's extension or independent crop consultants. So you have the people who are recommending how the product is used, and then you have the enforcement component. So there are a lot of stakeholders, there are a lot of players in this idea of pesticide use and what that looks like. And then on the flip side, you have mitigation measures. So you have different groups who are working in that space. There is some overlap, and sometimes there's not. So that could be research, like private sector, public. There's a lot of people researching conservation measures for a lot of different resource concerns, right? So it's not all just related to soil erosion or water quality protection. But then you have extension programming, conservation planning from whether that's through federal programs, state programs, and then also that program participation. There are grants in place right now working with looking at conservation adoption and how to put systems in place that are helping growers be sustainable into the future. So all of those fit in that mitigation measure, group. And then you have the species protection. And once again, some of those people that are working in the space of pesticide stewardship, conservation, adoption, they overlap with species protection and recovery, and sometimes they're separate. So we've got all these different conversations going on, all these people doing research, and we're really looking at how those fit together. And so for species protection and recovery, you're looking at federal action, state, local, and then you have the introduction of the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are also working in this space, whether it's for species specific protection or recovery, or it's habitat based. So the key is to figure out how those interact together and where that and how agriculture fits into that. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges, and this is a very personal slide to me, which I'll explain in a minute, but there are some challenges with this intersection, and some of those are very specific to agriculture. But the general descriptions of habitat in the draft herbicide strategy, the descriptions of habitat were very general, terrestrial and aquatic. I mean, there was a little bit of background to them, but for the most part, they were fairly general. And that is difficult for growers because growers are not trained to identify habitat. And so providing very specific attributes of habitat that would be best for species, understanding that really helps for growers to know the areas that they really need to protect. But agriculture doesn't look the same across the United States. It's very diverse. It has different field shapes. It has regional and crop-specific production practices. I spent part of my summer in Washington State this last year, and I did a crop tour. And because most of my career has been spent east of the Mississippi, I had no idea of the diversity of how crops were managed, where you have potatoes, onions, seed crops, and the length of rotation and how management plays into that, whether that's pest management or mitigation measures that a grower may want to put on the land. It's not just about them, one grower. It may be about 3 or 4 growers who are using that same ground over a period of time to grow different crops. And then you have your edge of field and terrestrial pest pressure. So how does that look different between areas where you may have higher pest pressure in some parts of the country than you do in other parts of the country just because of landscape? I pulled 2 quick overviews, one from Eastern Nebraska and one from North Georgia. The Eastern Nebraska, the fields are square. There's not a lot of terrestrial habitat in this view. There's a little bit of water down on the east side or the west side of this picture, but these are irrigated fields. They're square, they're large. And then the North Georgia example, this is my family's farm. So my family farms in North Georgia. There's a lot of water. There's a lot of terrestrial habitat. The fields are small. They're bordered on both sides by rivers. And so the discussions that we have to have about pest management and production practices and protecting those in addressing the environmental concerns are very different than you would have in a conversation where you have square fields with little terrestrial habitat. So those discussions are just different. They're both important, but just different. And so those present challenges that are not where you have a national decision and you have to apply it at a local level. That's where it really becomes difficult to figure out that intersection between all 3 of these. Next slide, please. Some solutions, flexibility. I do feel strongly that if we say there are challenges, we need to think about ways to solve the challenges. Flexibility for these complex production systems, figuring out a way to include a site-specific nature of conservation planning, because conservation planning is field level, it is site-specific. Clear definitions of potential species habitat, I think, is a one that we've had a lot of conversations around over the last few months. Education programs that provide species-specific material and actions needed to aid in recovery. This is something that comes out in some of the recovery plans and 5-year reviews that we've been reading from Fish and Wildlife, is that the idea that landowners may not know that they are bordering a species. They may not know that they're within the range of a species until somebody has the conversation with them. And so some of it is just lack of knowledge because it is not the space in which they exist. Some sort of tiered approach to efficiency point system in the mitigation menu. I like to use cover crops as an example. That's where my historical research has been. Cover crops that are over 6 feet high and have a lot of biomass produce different benefits than cover crops that are small and don't get to grow as high because of weather conditions, snow, et cetera. So there are different levels of intensity when it comes to cover crops. So that's a good example. Stakeholder involvement, especially stakeholders with diverse production systems, being able to hear those voices and how these mitigation measures are used on their farms. And then lastly, targeted research. So really figuring out what the questions are that need to be answered and how best to answer those questions. So are growers being asked to implement and adopt mitigation measures that are not necessary, protective of, or provide a benefit to listed species? The idea that a grower has to get a certain number of points, but maybe conservation tillage and cover crops provide enough, are able to keep the soil and water on the field without additional practices, but yet they have to do additional practices to meet the number of points. From an economic perspective, what are the benefits and costs of that? And then lastly, if the ESA, if Endangered Species Act is driving the move to incorporate additional spray drift, sediment, and erosion mitigations, what is the link to listed species, and is more or less mitigation scientifically necessary? So really bringing in that data component of, okay, where are the data gaps? Where do we need more information so that we can move forward with making sure that the mitigation measures are appropriate to the resource concern? Next slide, please. So BMPs, like I said, we throw around a lot of words, but best management practices are really the definition of conservation practices and mitigation measures, but practical control mitigate measures, including technological, economic, and institutional considerations that have demonstrated to effectively minimize water quality impacts. The example here, I pulled these from Oregon State's best management practices, and this is just the example from the grass waterway. And you can see here the picture to the left, there's visible erosion. The picture to the right is where they've addressed that, but it's not with one grass waterway, it's with 3. And so being able to adopt successful best management practices and conservation actions, it has to be very local to determine what is actually needed on the field to really address that resource concern, especially given these dynamic changes we see, whether that's more intense rainfall, so more inches of water coming in a very short amount of time. So how do we address those resource concerns when are these dynamic changes? Next slide, please. USDA did a survey back in 2022 where they looked at conservation practice adoption motivations. And as you can see, the link is at the bottom. If you haven't read this, this is the fact sheet that came along with it. It's a nice study, provides a lot of insight. So this shows that 86% of survey respondents are using tillage practices, and that's on 83% of the land applied to the cropland among the respondents who answered. And so you can see the most tillage practices, irrigation management, system improvements, pest management, drainage, water management, nutrient management, and cover crops. So there are a lot of best management practices, conservation practices, mitigation measures that are being adopted by growers now and will continue because there are economic benefits to them in their production systems. They don't want their soil to leave their field any more than anybody else does. And so I think it's that stewardship that they have to really continue to produce. Next slide, please. And then BMPs being used on the ag landscape. I think this is a really great example. Ron Graber spoke at a discussion we had several years ago, pre-COVID, about the Kansas Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy, or RAPS, as it related to the city of Wichita. And this is just an example. It's a great example of where they used partnerships to be able to address a resource concern. In this case, it was a TMDL regulated stream. And then they worked with growers, they worked with the urban developers, the city, to be able to address the resource concerns. They also included an education and awareness campaign for growers, pesticide dealers, and crop consultants. So they really worked from the bottom up to be able to address this resource concern through the use of best management practices. And I think this is a great example. The link is there. If you've not heard of this program in Kansas, I would suggest taking a look at it, because I do think it's a great example of how BMPs can be used, not regulatory, but voluntarily through an incentive program to be able to address a resource concern. And with that, I think the next slide is Taylor's.
Thank you, Leah. So I think by this point, it really goes without saying, but right now the agriculture industry faces challenges unlike ever before, whether that be from managing pests, raising input prices, fluctuating global markets, navigating weather and labor challenges, water use and scarcity, keeping up with consumer demands, and really just doing their best to stay in business each and every day. Remaining sustainable on the farm is a tremendous challenge for our growers to achieve. Next slide. But in order for farms to remain sustainable for the future, growers must have productive farmland that continues to produce an economical product, and they must continue to implement practices that support healthy land and water for habitat and other ecological services, because these are actually the practices that promote overall farm health, allowing those farms to continue to exist and steward the land for generations into the future, and continue to exist to be passed down to children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. But right now, production margins are extremely thin. It's really hard to make a profit on the farm. But farmers really have a personal connection to their land and feel strongly about caring for it to ensure that it continues to remain in the family for years to come. So just think about your favorite family heirloom. For many farmers, their land is that heirloom, and there's something special about protecting that land, its wildlife, its environment, ecology, and its resources to provide for generations to come. Next slide. So the ability to participate in conservation programs such as those offered by NRCS and FSA play a critical role in overall farm sustainability and the ability to really steward farmland and its natural resources, because these are the types of programs that help growers implement the best management practices at the local farm level, which then provides the infrastructure that's needed to help mitigate the movement of pollutants across the landscape and protect those natural resources. So there's a lot of different programs available that cover a wide variety of different services, but most programs have similar services of providing information and planning support for various projects, financial assistance to help overcome barriers to implementing and installing best management practices, equipment services such as rentals in certain situations to help with implementing the different practices, and really just overall technical assistance for installing BMP practices where necessary. Next slide. So what exactly is the value of these programs at the farm level? Well, it's really important to recognize that when talking about some of the BMPs that Leah outlined earlier, implementing can be extremely costly for our growers. Not only are many long-term investments that require upkeep and maintenance over the years to remain effective in mitigating the pollutant movement, but some BMPs actually require growers to install the practice on productive areas of their land, which may eliminate the ability to produce a profitable crop on that piece of land. And so depending on the installation and maintenance required by the particular BMP, specialized equipment may also be necessary, adding an additional expense to the practice. So again, at a time when the margin between a profitable year and an economic year in the negative is extremely thin, it can really be difficult to justify practices that don't offer a direct return on investment immediately that first year, benefiting crop yield. So if you think about applying a fertilizer to a crop, you know that that practice is going to increase your yield, therefore increasing your profit and covering that additional expense. With many best management practices, the economic benefit may not be direct, or it might take a couple years to really accumulate and see that benefit. And this could be a significant barrier to some growers. And this is an area where conservation programs really help by providing the resources for implementing the practices on the farm that may not show that quick, direct return on investment, at least there in the beginning. So these programs can help growers overcome that initial financial barrier to implementation, and then provide opportunities for all to participate in mitigating the movements of pollutants across the landscape while meeting those environmental objectives. I've never met a grower that doesn't want to support the land and the environment, and ultimately conservation programs can help them do that by providing the physical and economic resources for implementing these BMPs on the farm, without which the installation and maintenance could be economically challenging for some growers. Next slide. So when we specifically think about supporting the continued mitigation and minimization of pesticide movement across the landscape, conservation programs will be a critical component moving forward from both an infrastructure and an information standpoint, because many of these programs are designed specifically to mitigate the movement of pollutants, including pesticides, across the landscape. So programs such as these offer a really unique opportunity to work with area experts at the local or regional level. So these are folks who know exactly what's going on the local landscape. They're familiar with cropping systems, the weather and the climate in a particular region, and other unique features that could influence the project. So working with this local knowledge enables the specific land characteristics to be addressed within the project by implementing that BMP by someone who understands the local landscape very well. This is an absolutely critical component of success when implementing a BMP. The practice must be tailored to the specific need in order to be effective, and oftentimes that is directly influenced by the local need, the landscape, or even the topography of the region. So understanding and working with the unique characteristics of the land to design and implement conservation practices offers a greater chance of successful implementation, along with mitigating any off-field pesticide movement and overall listed species protection. Next slide. So along with the conservation programs offered through USDA at the federal level, there are several commodity-specific or state programs available that offer a more refined approach to implementing those BMPs by addressing specific needs at a smaller, often more regionalized scale. So these more specific and refined programs have the opportunity to provide a local bridge to regulatory compliance. I'm sure there's more out there, and we'd love to hear from you if there's something that we've missed, but a couple examples that we're familiar with include programs in Michigan and Florida. So the Michigan Agriculture Environmental Assurance Program offered through the Michigan Department of Agriculture is an example of a proactive program that helps farmers and farms of all sizes and commodities voluntarily protect and minimize agricultural pollutant risk. So specifically within the cropping system category, this program focuses on stewardship of the land and the water, including field-based activities such as water use, soil conservation, and nutrient management, and cover all crops grown in Michigan, including field crops, vegetables, fruit orchards, greenhouse crops, and ornamental trees. So working with a program technician, the farm is assessed, and then a plan of action is developed that's actually tailored to the specific farm, to the specific land and the cropping systems there, in order to prevent runoff and erosion, while continuing to produce a healthy, economical crop. So this program helps identify information on a technical and financial assistance if that's necessary, and then follows up with the recommended practices that are being addressing those environmental concerns. Actually looked this morning, and there's 6,316 farms that have been verified so far through this program. So this is a tremendous voluntary effort conducted by the Michigan Department of Agriculture that really shows the personal responsibility that these farmers are taking to steward their land and protect their natural resources. Another example is the Florida Department of Agriculture BMP program, which offers commodity-specific BMPs that advise producers on how to manage the water, nutrients, and pesticides being applied on their farms. Through this program, there's several resources available, including commodity-specific manuals and other technical information that actually guide the producer on how to manage their specific crop inputs in a way that both protects yield and the environment. So both of these programs offer a really neat opportunity and a way to help growers overcome some of those financial hurdles associated with starting BMPs on their farms, as well as implementing other mitigation measures. And they pair the practice with local commodity-specific knowledge that can lead to a greater chance of a successful implementation of those mitigation practices. Next slide. So I hope that we all can agree that agriculture production across the U.S. is extremely dynamic, it's really diverse, and oftentimes it is very unique. Everyone could list a different example, but if I think about personally the rolling wheat fields, grape vineyards, orchards of all kinds, production fields of cotton or other agronomic crops, corn in the Midwest, cranberries in the Northeast, soybeans, or vegetable fields. There's so many different types of production systems throughout the country that all utilize the land very differently. Whether it's the structure of the production system, how the irrigation is applied, if it's applied at all, how the crop is managed, how the shape or the configuration of the land is leveraged within that cropping system, or even what season is that crop produced. No two crops are grown in the same way, just like no two landscapes are the same, which means it's really challenging to think of all of these different cropping systems in the same manner when it comes to mitigating pesticide and pollutant movement. According to the EPA, there's over 182 different ecoregions in the U.S., which is a lot of different ecology regions around the country. And with this level of ecological diversity, a one-size-fits-all approach to mitigating pesticide spray drift, surface runoff, and erosion becomes extremely challenging. Next slide. So how do we overcome this tremendous level of ecological diversity to support mitigation across a broad landscape within the U.S.? Well, leveraging conservation programs, the financial assistance that they can provide to growers, along with effective science-based mitigation measures, would provide a realistic opportunity of successful adoption on the farm. In fact, included on the herbicide strategy, the EPA has included participation in a conservation program on land where the pesticide would actually be applied. And this would be made as an exemption and an alternative to implementing practices from the mitigation menu. And this is an excellent option for growers who participate in these programs. For this effort to be successful, however, I think it's really important to understand the barriers to continued participation or lack of participation in these conservation programs. There must be opportunities for farmers to continue to grow their conservation efforts within the program and have continued ability to participate in financial assistance programs, whether at the federal, state, or local level. Next slide. So measurable outcomes are needed to scientifically document the need for and the impacts from adopting endangered species mitigation efforts. And I believe that this is a great opportunity for the scientific and extension communities to come together to conduct research across the landscape that investigates what mitigations are necessary, what existing conservation practices have already been adopted by growers around the country, and what level of reduction and off-site movement of pesticides is already occurring from these existing conservation practices. It's critical that we fully understand the baseline in order to clearly identify the need for additional mitigation measures to protect listed species, and then if needed, understand which measures are most appropriate and effective. Next slide. So to wrap things up, the ability to use pesticides to protect crop yields and maximize production form the foundation of food production, allowing each of us to do our part in helping sustain the world's population. And the parameters surrounding the use of these products must be achievable by growers. So continuing to produce an economically and environmentally sound, viable food, feed, and fiber is the ultimate challenge. But it's important to recognize that adding additional mitigation requirements for protection of listed species on pesticide labels adds a new level of complexity to pest management for our farmers. Next slide. So we'd like to leave you with these top 3 takeaways today. The first being incorporating mitigation into the regulatory framework changes the site-specific nature of conservation practices that are already in place. Second, entities must work together to achieve the common goal of protecting family farms and listed species, along with feeding the world. This is a tremendous challenge. And number 3, we must build mitigation practices on a foundation of sound science. Next slide. So that's all that we have today. Be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
There are several questions already in the queue, and so thank you, Taylor and Leah, for that very comprehensive presentation in a very short period of time. A lot of information. So Taylor, since you were last, I'll actually start with you. There's a question: what is the value of education as a method of mitigating pesticide movement from an extension perspective?
I think that's a great question. Education is a very effective tool in mitigating pesticide movement, mitigating the movement of pollutants, and really just protecting any sensitive site. Education offers a really unique opportunity to keep our pesticide applicators, especially in extension, up to date on the latest information on pesticide applications, new technologies and practices that pesticide applicators can use to really ensure that the application of that product remains where it should. And so it really offers a good opportunity to build relationships and continue educating our community on sound science. In Georgia, we have an excellent program that has shown to be very effective in protecting sensitive sites from off-target pesticide movement. And I think education is a really good opportunity to continue working with pesticide applicators to ensure they have the latest information moving forward.
Great, thank you for that. Another question, and Leah, this one may be for you. It says, can you expand on the challenges of mitigation decisions as it relates to land ownership and rotation considerations?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. This is one where I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about it, because we've had a number of different discussions in different meetings we've been at across the country where growers have talked about, well, I have to work with my landowner, and my landowner is not one person. It might be a group of people. It might be owned by a firm. It might be owned by someone who doesn't live in the location. So absentee landowners. So it starts to change the discussions that you're having with the people who own the land versus the people who manage the land. And so it really starts to shape if I need to put in a grass waterway as a grower, as the person who's managing the land, if I know I have an issue where I need to put in a grass waterway, who do I need to talk to? Whose permission do I get? How do I get that permission? What happens if next year they decide not to rent the land to me? So we've got all these different conversations about, especially in areas of the country where there's a high percentage of rented land, it really starts to make it complex. And I touched on it with the Washington State example, but that's just one example there where you may have, because of the rotational needs of those crops, you may have different people growing the same, different people farming the same land one year and then different people farming it the next. And not because it's changing hands, but because those are just how the crops are rotated through the system. And so I think that being able to figure out a way to have those discussions is a place where I know that there's going to have to be a lot of assistance with growers of how to maneuver through those. I know that working with NRCS, those are always conversations about how to get conservation on the land when you don't own the land. So there's definitely people who've been putting a lot of thought into that in the past of how you increase a conservation adoption on rented land.
Great, thanks for that, Leah. Definitely not a easy solution all the time.
No.
Just a quick question. We have other questions in the queue, but there is a question about the recording on today's presentation and other presentations. And someone said, I would like to share them. And Carlos, please correct me if I'm wrong, but all of the presentations and recording will be posted to CAST's website. So you would be able to basically get those on the website.
That is correct.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have some other questions here. Question from Sam Polly. It says, do you have any kind of generalized or average unit cost for select mitigation measures, such as terracing or contour buffer strips?
Yeah, I can take that first, and then Taylor, if you have something to add. So yes, there are. I would point number one to USDA Office of Pesticide Management. OPMP has done a lot of work in that space of looking at mitigation measures and the cost of those. Most of those you can find in their comments on the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project and the draft herbicide strategy. NRCS comes up with generalized or average costs for their practices. Those are all publicly available on their website. And then just I guess shameless plug. There's a paper in agricultural and environmental letters that we just did on this topic, on the agroeconomic cost of meeting these mitigation measures. And that information, we have some tables in there that kind of put together some of those general costs. So yes, those data are out there. It's just being able to find it, but I would definitely start with some of USDA's comments that they've made recently. And Taylor, do you?
No, that was good. Yeah.
All right, we have a number of other questions coming in, and this one's sort of tangentially related. So I'll just ask, Jessica Chen asks, what would be a mechanism to certify local best management practice programs so that they can be considered as ESA mitigations?
we don't have the criteria for that. I think that is, I think that's an area where we know that there's work being done on trying to identify what that criteria would be. But I think at this point, as it relates to the herbicide strategy, we don't have enough information about what those criteria would be to fully answer this question. But I think it's a really good question because it really gets into the idea of if there are these exemptions available for people participating in those programs, what does that program have to look like? I think that is definitely a question that has to be answered as we move forward. But I think that's still being worked out by EPA.
Yeah, and I would just add, Leah, obviously a lot of folks from industry, a lot of grower groups had responded to that very comment to the exemption piece that was printed in the herbicide strategy. So it's a very good question, something that we look for more clarification on, because as you and Taylor mentioned, there are a lot of state programs already out there that growers are involved in. So what counts and what does not count? It's a very good question. Because a lot of growers would like to think that any program they're involved in would count as some type of a certified program. But I think that remains to be seen. So another question, what are growers, producers' thoughts related to proposed mitigations? Will they be able to satisfy the ESA requirements for runoff mitigations?
Leah, I can start with that one and then just feel free to add in. So it really depends on the commodity and the cropping system. Some growers, especially in some of the agronomic crops, so especially here around Georgia, are already implementing some of the BMPs and the conservation practices that are listed on the mitigation menu. But then some of our specialty crop growers, particularly our vegetable growers, they're in a very unique production system, and not many of the production practices or the mitigation practices on the menu are really compatible with their current systems. So it really depends on the production systems, and if growers feel at this point they can reach the number of practices that they would need to reach at this time.
Great. Anything to add, Leah? Or
Nope. Perfect.
Okay. Have another question from Katie Savinelli. It says, for data-driven measurable outcomes, are there funding opportunities for land grant universities? What organizations are providing funding for developing these outcomes?
That's a really great question. I'm not sure. If anybody else has any thoughts to add, I would love to learn if there's funding opportunities. It's an area that I'm particularly interested in. So I would love to learn if there's some funding opportunities available, but I'm not 100% sure.
I think there are, I think one of the difficulties in this space is there are funding opportunities for research in conservation systems, in conservation practices in that space, because that is where Taylor exists. That's where I existed in my prior life. And so there are funding opportunities for that. And those research efforts are going on as it relates to conservation practices and systems. It's that linkage between pesticides and endangered species where I think the question is how do you make that linkage in research, and are there funding opportunities for that? And I mean, I think for just the conservation practices in agricultural production systems, that research is going on now, but how to link it together with the pesticides and the species is where I think the bigger question lies.
Right. And this may be a question for both or either of you. Have you worked with co-ops that custom spray for growers?
So we've had a wide variety of conversations with a lot of different stakeholders. So we just recently did a presentation for the Ag Retailers Association as a larger group. But as far as and we've talked to different distributors, but as far as specifically targeting those co-ops for people who do custom spraying, we've had those conversations. They've been very sort of on the fly as we've been at different meetings, at different grower meetings. So they've not been sort of broad, I guess. So not specifically targeted to co-ops. Yeah.
Okay, just pull up the other questions here. We have a question from Ben Gleason. It says, how will timing of pesticide use decisions, mitigation decisions, applying for cost share, and implementing best management practices be feasible in a crop year and potential changes with the next crop?
I think this gets into the complexity, right, Taylor? Like, I think this gets into the, I mean, I think this is exactly one of the things that as we were putting together this paper and we were talking about it, and I think it's in all of our conversations, is that this, I think, is the crux of the difficulty, right, of the challenges, is because growers are faced with so many different decisions, and they don't necessarily, a lot of growers don't have a set rotation, right? So what they grow next year is dependent on a lot of different things, whether that's the weather, the weather patterns in the Midwest versus the Southeast, or how much rain, how much snowfall they're expecting to get in parts of the West. So I think that the complexity of those year-to-year management changes and how you maneuver through those, I think is one of the challenges to me of how you make this work in a way that growers have some level of predictability about what products they can use from year to year.
Definitely not an easy solution or process. No. So another question, we say it's, are you aware of any process or ability to have new mitigation measures added to the lists? An example would be the use of floating treatment wetlands and channels and detention basins.
So I would offer other people to speak up here as well. I think one of the best places to get those into list is to provide comments on documents. The comments have closed for the draft herbicide strategy, obviously, but there are going to be other comment periods open, whether that's for a specific product or proposed interim decisions or the insecticide strategy when it comes out. So I think the most direct way to do that is through those comments by providing the practices that maybe aren't included on the list, why they should be included, and any available data that might go along with those practices that would support the inclusion of those practices on the list. I am going to write down that practice because I'm always looking for new ones as we talk through this. So I will add that to my list of things to look at. But I do think the best way to get things into the process, unless somebody else wants to speak up, is really through that comment period.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Leah, and I think that's a great recommendation, because obviously that's the only one right now. But also whatever commodity you're in, if there is a commodity group involved, trying to actually work with the larger commodity group to understand, what EPA knows about certain practices in certain commodity groups, because I think not everything is necessarily covered in all those mitigations, and there may be something very regional in certain cases that's not taken into account that growers should be getting credit for. So really trying to work with different commodity groups and just understanding what's there and what's not there.
Yep.
Okay, so I don't see any more open questions currently in the chat. We still have a few more minutes if anyone has other questions. Oh, we actually do have a question now. Oh, actually, maybe a comment, Tillman. So it says, I think if someone has a viable mitigation option, request meeting with EPA to discuss. You do not have to wait. So thank you, Tillman, for that. Or we can send them all to Tillman. And sorry, Tillman. So, and also invite Bernalyn or Stanley. I don't know if you had other questions, comments on any of the questions asked thus far. More than welcome to have any comments.
I don't really have any comments. I think the presentation gave a good overview of the complexity and the needs for additional research and communication in this topic before running off with a program and assuming that everyone will understand and be able to implement it. I think it's going to take time and input and attention from all of us to reach a good spot where we have that little center of the 3 circles that Leah showed us in the slides.
Great, thank you. And I'll just take one last opportunity to thank the presenters for, again, a very, very comprehensive presentation on a very difficult subject. And, you know, as we move forward with this, I think it's the more we can educate everybody on ESA, because, you know, as we like to say, changes are coming, you know, or changes are here. And so I think the more that folks understand the impact that this will have, then we can basically move some things forward. So with that, Chris, I will turn it over to you for any final comments.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Leah. We appreciate your time that you put into not only crafting, but giving the presentation today and answering some pretty tough questions. And of course, thank you, Bernalyn and others who have been to every webinar and answering questions all along. So a few notes. We do have 2 webinars remaining in this series. You can see them on your screen at this time, February 20 and March 12. This is all leading up to a final presentation, an event at the CLA and RISE conference in mid-April that we're doing in partnership with CropLife America. More details to be provided on that. Just do an internet search for that conference. You'll find it. You'll get a sense of the dates. We're just kind of fine-tuning some of the details around that before we announce exactly how that's going to go. But all of this leading up to that. All right. Also, I just want you to all quick note that we did have a newscast paper launched not that long ago. If you're interested in learning more about RNA interference in agriculture, you can use that QR code on your screen at this time and download that publication. Take a look at the presentation, etc. We did have a webinar on that as well. Upcoming papers, in addition to the one I mentioned around FIFRA ESA, February 27th, we'll be talking about the next plant invasion, how to prevent it. That'll be produced in conjunction with NASMA, and that'll be a webinar release. It will not be in person, it's just a webinar. So be on the lookout for that and register. Also, we will have an in-person paper rollout March 20 in St. Louis at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, all around gene-edited crops. And that's going to be a very interesting presentation. So if you're in the St. Louis area, I highly encourage you to attend. More details coming. And there will be a webinar associated with that event as well. So be on the lookout for these things. All right. I just want you to know one thing that I did not mention earlier about CAST is that we do have the Board Log CAST Communication Award. Nominations for that award are open at this time. You can see some details on your screen. Do look at the QR code for the nomination packet. You can download that. And we've extended our deadline so that more individuals can apply because we've basically pushed back our announcement date. So we want to give more time for quality applications to roll in, and those are rolling in at this time. So if you see or know a person who is an excellent communicator in the sciences, please do encourage them to apply or nominate them. All right, moving on then to the final thing I want to mention here, and that is CAST membership. If you're interested in becoming a CAST member at the individual level, as an organization, please do feel free to reach out to me and my colleagues at CAST. You can contact us using the information you see on the screen at this time, and do again, scan the QR code for further information. So with that, I want to wrap up by saying thank you to everyone. Thank you to our presenters, moderator, and all those who joined today. We hope you'll come back for the next 2 webinars in this series. With that, thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.